The silence of Nemazini Station was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a carefully curated quiet that hummed with the weight of 1,000,000,000,000 memories. It was the sound of data flowing through crystalline conduits, of environmental systems breathing life into sterile corridors, and of history itself being held in a delicate, unending stasis. For Elias Thorne, Junior Archivist 3rd Class, this silence was the only him he had ever truly known. His entire life had been spent here, in the metallic heart of the Chronos Archives, the great and silent arbiter of galactic truth, a duty humanity had accepted 5 centuries ago not with pride, but with a weary resignation, for they understood better than any other species the crushing burden of being the galaxy's memory. Other races built empires, forged weapons of stellar destruction, or composed symphonies that could bend space-time. But humanity kept the records. They were the librarians at the end of history, the custodians of every treaty, the witnesses to every atrocity, the guardians of every fragile peace. They did not make the rules, they simply remembered them, and in remembering, gave them power. Elias's workstation, a simple alcove of dark metal and softly glowing screens, overlooked the orrery, a vast, dark sphere where the history of every known civilization was represented by a swirling mote of light, a constellation of triumphs and failures held in perfect, incorruptible order. His task, like that of the 1,000 other archivists on Mnemosone, was verification. When a dispute arose on some distant world, when a 500-year-old trade agreement was questioned, a query would be routed to the archives, and it was his job to delve into the data stream, authenticate the relevant record, and transmit the unvarnished truth back to the concordance on Spire. It was a sacred, monotonous, and utterly vital role. The peace of the galaxy, a bickering, sprawling, and barely tolerant peace was not kept by warships, but by query responses, by the simple, unimpeachable authority of a time-stamped document pulled from the infinite memory of the archives. This morning, however, was different. A directive had arrived from Earth a month prior, a sealed order that had propagated through the entire archivist network with a quiet, unnerving finality. It was not to be opened until a specific set of algorithmic triggers were met, and for 31 days it had sat in Elias's queue, a dark spot in his otherwise pristine workflow. He had tried to ignore it, to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of verifying mining rights in the Asteria Belt and cross-referencing dynastic lineages for the Cathar Regency. But the unread directive pulsed with a latent energy that felt like a coming storm. The storm broke with a chime, a sound so sharp and clear it seemed to cut through the station's foundational hum. It was a Priority 1 query, a designation reserved for matters that threatened quadrant-wide stability, and it came from the highest authority, High Mediator Lyra of the Cygnian Ascendancy, the de facto leader of the Concordance. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach as the query's details materialized on his screen. The subject was the Glyphican Heresy Accords, the single most volatile and critical treaty in the galaxy's history. It was the accord that had ended a 1,000-year holy war between the fanatical Glyphican Dominion and the coalition of secular worlds they sought to convert or destroy. The treaty was a masterpiece of ambiguity and compromise, a document whose every clause had been fought over for a generation, and its only complete, authenticated copy resided here, within the Chronos Archives. The request was simple. Lyra required a full, unredacted verification of Annex 4, Section 3, which detailed the demarcation of sacred space around the Dominion's ancient homeworld. A minor faction within the Dominion was claiming the Concordance had violated the terms, a common enough occurrence. But this time, the rhetoric was escalating with unprecedented speed. This was the trigger. As the query finished loading, the sealed directive from Earth automatically unspooled itself. The text was stark, devoid of explanation or apology. Directive 734, the Sol Mandate, is now in effect. All external access to the Kronos archives is hereby suspended. All incoming queries, regardless of priority or origin, are to be met with a singular response: access denied. Record sealed by Terran mandate. There will be no further communication. Hold the line. Elias read it once, then twice, the words feeling alien and impossible. Suspend access. It was unthinkable. It was like telling a star to stop shining. The archives were a universal constant, a utility as fundamental as gravity. To deny access was to deny reality itself. He looked from the directive to Lyra's query, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm. His entire life, his entire culture, was built on the principle of open, absolute truth. This directive was an act of heresy against his own people's most sacred duty. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, escalating the issue to his superior, Director Valerius. But he knew it would be pointless. Valerius would have the same directive. This was not a glitch. It was a decision, a cold and calculated move made by a government on a world he had never even seen. His fingers hovered over his console, trembling slightly. The system prompted him for a response protocol. He could fulfill the query, upholding centuries of tradition, or he could obey the mandate, shattering the foundation upon which galactic peace was built. He thought of the stories of the heresy wars, of suns being extinguished and entire species erased from existence. A cataclysm held at bay only by the memory stored in this station. And yet, he was a child of Earth, a servant of the Terran administration that governed the archives. His loyalty, in the end, was not to the concordance that used the archives, but to the humanity that maintained them. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like a betrayal, Elias selected the new protocol. He typed the response code, and the system flashed the words back at him for confirmation: access denied. Record sealed by Terran mandate. He pressed enter. The signal, carrying its payload of negation, shot out from Menamazani at the speed of light, a silent bullet aimed at the heart of the galaxy. On the shimmering world of Spire, where towers of pure light pierced clouds of iridescent gas, High Mediator Lyra watched the response arrive on her floating hollow podium within the grand chamber of the Concordance. Her avian features, usually a mask of serene and unshakable authority, tightened in confusion. She had expected the usual data packet, a dry but definitive confirmation that would quell the Glyphocan uprising before it began. Instead, she saw 5 words that made no sense. Access denied. Record sealed by Terran mandate. A murmur rippled through the assembled delegates. 100 different species reacting in 100 different ways. The insectoid Hivani chittered in agitation. The gelatinous Polians quivered, and the crystalline silicates chimed with discordant notes of alarm. What is the meaning of this? Lyra's voice boomed, amplified by the chamber's acoustics. Is this a Terran attempt at humor? She directed the question at the human ambassador, a perpetually weary man named Chen, who looked as stunned as she was. I have no information. High Mediator, he stammered, his face pale. This is unprecedented. Lyra's disbelief quickly hardened into fury. The humans were functionaries, record keepers. They did not have the authority to seal a foundational accord. She ordered her aides to resubmit the query, then to submit others testing the system. She demanded the trade agreements with the Voltan Consortium, the ceasefire lines of the Outer Rim, the charter granting the Mechanist guilds their autonomy. Back on Menamazani, Elias watched the consequences of his single keystroke unfold. A cascade of red alerts flooded his screen, a torrent of Priority 1 queries from across the galaxy, each one a panicked scream in the sudden darkness. And one by one, the station's automated system, now operating under the Sol mandate, sent back the same 5 words: access denied. The orrery in the center of the station began to change. The clear, stable lights of established treaties and settled histories began to flicker, their connections to the living galaxy severed. It was as if a creeping fog was rolling through the stars and obscuring all the things they once thought certain. Within the hour, the Concordance was in chaos. The Glyphican Dominion, seeing the denial as a sign of Concordance weakness, declared the treaty void and launched an attack on a nearby pilgrimage site. A centuries-old border dispute between 2 reptilian races, once settled by archival evidence, flared into an open skirmish. On the financial networks, markets crashed as resource charters and corporate patents, all authenticated by the archives, became worthless scraps of data. Yes, I sold it. Every point of law, every line on a map, every settled fact that held their fragile civilization together was suddenly thrown into doubt, because the one source that could prove any of it had gone silent. The galaxy was being gaslit by its own memory. Elias felt a profound sickness, the kind that came from watching the world end on a data screen. He sent a message to Director Valerius, his hands shaking too much to type properly. "The system is unraveling. What have we done?" Her reply was instantaneous and chillingly calm. "We have reminded them that memory is not a service. It is a privilege. Hold the line. Archivist." Back on Spire, drenched in the rising tide of panic and fear, High Mediator Lyra made a decision. Her advisors urged caution, diplomacy, a gentle probe to understand the humans' motives. But Lyra's pride had been wounded. The archivists had forgotten their place. They were the help, and the help was now refusing to answer the bell. She overrode the dissenters, her voice cutting through the cacophony of the chamber. "The Terrans have abrogated their sacred duty. They have taken the galaxy's history hostage. This cannot stand." She activated her command authority, her voice ringing with an arrogance that would echo through the coming ages. "Dispatch the 3rd Diplomatic Flotilla to Minamazani Station. We are not going to ask for our history back. We are going to take it." Oh, the 3rd Diplomatic Flotilla cleaved through the void not with the brutish menace of warships, but with the arrogant grace of their purpose. They were Signian vessel, elegant constructs of pearlescent alloy and solar sails that caught the light of distant stars like the wings of cosmic birds. Their official designation was enforcement, their unofficial purpose, a reminder of who held the leash. At their head was the Unwavering Gaze, flagship of Commander Kalen, a Signian of impeccable lineage and a career built on pacifying unruly protectorates with a minimum of fuss and a maximum of condescending authority. To Kalen, this mission was an insult, a janitorial task. A gaggle of Terran data clerks had thrown a tantrum, and he was being sent to put them back in their place. His bridge was a symphony of calm efficiency, the air scented with the ozone tang of active energy shields and the faint, floral perfume favored by his species. He stood on the command dais, taloned hands clasped behind his back, watching the star charts resolve the route to the Terminus system, the unremarkable stellar body that hosted Namazani Station. "Report," he clipped, his voice sharp and melodious. "We are 2 cycles from the system's outer marker, Commander," his navigator chirped. "No hostile signatures detected. The system is quiet." Kalen let out a soft, dismissive puff of air. "Of course it's quiet. They are librarians. We will likely find them cowering behind their data stacks. Open a channel to the station. Standard diplomatic protocol, Priority Alpha. Inform them that a concordance delegation has arrived to discuss their operational difficulties. The message was sent, a crisp, official packet of authority and veiled threat. On Minamazani, the incoming transmission flashed on every archivist's screen, an icon of a predator announcing its presence. Elias felt his blood run cold. It was one thing to deny a query. It was another to face down a fleet. The station's internal comms remained silent. No orders to panic. No call to battle stations. There was only the continued, unnerving hum of the Soul Mandate at work. Then, a summons appeared on his private console. Director Valerius requests your presence. Central Core. Elias's journey to the core was a descent into the station's true heart. He left behind the sterile, functional levels of the archivists and entered a space that felt ancient and alive. Here, the crystalline data conduits were thick as tree trunks, pulsing with a soft, internal light, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the sheer density of stored information. Director Valerius stood before the core's primary interface, a shimmering wall of light that depicted not the orrery of history, but the station's own nervous system. She was older than Elias had realized up close, her face a roadmap of quiet burdens and long-held secrets. She didn't turn as he approached. They mistake our function for our purpose. Archivist Thorn, she said, her voice a low counterpoint to the core's hum. For 500 years, we have served as the galaxy's memory. Do you know why humanity was chosen for this role? Elias shook his head. Because we are the only species to have nearly erased ourselves, she continued, her eyes fixed on the display. We built weapons that could shatter our own world, and we stared into that abyss. We learned that the most dangerous weapon is not a bomb, but a forgotten truth. So we chose to remember everything. She finally turned to him, and her gaze was as intense as a welding arc. The Concordance believes this archive is a tool, a resource to be mined. They have used our truths to win their wars, to justify their expansions, to legitimize their power, all while dismissing the keepers of those truths as little more than sentient machines. She gestured to the shimmering wall, and it shifted to show a timeline, a long, brutal litany of Terran requests for greater autonomy, for a voice in how their information was used, for protection for archivists sent to dangerous locales. Each one was stamped with the same response from the Concordance: denied, redundant, acknowledged, and tabled. They have bled us for our knowledge and offered us nothing in return, Valeria said, her voice dropping to a whisper of cold fury. They ignored our warnings when the archives predicted the Cathar famine. They buried our report on Cygnian corporations exploiting pre-contact worlds. They have treated our sacred duty as their divine right. The Soul Mandate is not a tantrum, Elias. It is a correction. An alert pinged softly. The unwavering gaze was at the system's edge, broadcasting its imperious demands. They believe their ships give them power, Valerius murmured. They are about to learn what real power looks like. I need you to access the Concordance personnel files for the entire Third Flotilla. Cross-reference them with sealed grievances, commendation disputes, and medical psych evaluations. I want to know every secret, every fear, every point of leverage on every one of those ships. You know the archives better than anyone. Show me their ghosts. And the request was a violation of every principle Elias had ever held. It was weaponizing the truth, turning the sacred act of remembering into an act of aggression. But as he looked at the director's resolute face and thought of the arrogant fleet preparing to board his home, he understood. This was a war, but it would not be fought with torpedoes. It would be fought with memory. Aboard the unwavering Gaze, Commander Kalen was growing impatient. An hour had passed, and Minamazani Station remained stubbornly silent, a small, dark spindle hanging in the void before them. It didn't even have its running lights on. It was a monolith of contemptuous silence. "They are refusing to acknowledge us," his communications officer reported, her feathers ruffled with indignation. "Move the flotilla to a close approach pattern," Kalen commanded. "Standard intimidation posture. Power up weapon systems, but do not lock on. I want them to see our teeth." The 10 Cygnian vessels moved with fluid grace, forming a crescent of elegant power around the silent station. On their bridges, crews worked with practiced ease, the low thrum of weapons capacitors charging, adding a new tension to the air. They were 100 kilometers from the station when it happened. It began not with a shield flare or a missile launch, but with a data packet, a tiny, encrypted burst of information that bypassed the flotilla's firewalls as if they weren't there and inserted itself directly into the ship's internal network. On the bridge of the Gilded Talon, the ship's tactical officer suddenly froze, his eyes wide. A file had appeared on his private console, a file containing the suppressed autopsy report of his brother, who had died on a routine patrol that the report now revealed was a disastrous, covered-up assault on a neutral outpost, an assault ordered by a Cygnian admiral who now sat on the Concordance High Council. On the sunlit blade, the chief engineer stared in horror at a financial statement showing his pension fund had been embezzled by a shell corporation with ties to High Mediator Lyra's own clan. Throughout the flotilla, it was the same. A navigator received proof that his mate was having an affair with his superior officer. A medic saw the unredacted clinical trial data for a life-saving drug his child had been denied, revealing it had been diverted to a Cygnian nobleman's vanity project. They were not grand revelations of state, but Amal, exquisitely painful and deeply personal truths, hatch one a perfectly aimed dagger of information, delivered silently and simultaneously to the one person it would hurt the most. On the unwavering Gaze, Commander Kalen watched the disciplined veneer of his command staff begin to crack. He saw a flicker of doubt here, a flash of pure rage there. The seamless unity of his bridge was fracturing, atomized by secrets he couldn't even see. Then, his own console chimed. The file that opened was small. It was a piece of art, a hollow painting of a Cygnian fledgling, rendered in soft, impossible colors. It was a secret portrait he had commissioned of his own illegitimate child, a child whose existence would shatter his career, disgrace his lineage, and violate the strict genetic purity laws of the Cygnian ascendancy. There was no text, no threat, just the image, and the certain knowledge that the librarians on that silent station and possessed the original authentication codes, the artist's contract, the hidden payment records, the absolute proof of his transgression. He could give the order to fire. He could blast the station into a cloud of vaporized data. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, that before the first energy beam reached its hull, this image and all its supporting proof would be broadcast not just to his crew, but to every public data stream in the galaxy. His life would be over. A cold sweat beaded on his feathered brow. His communications officer looked at him, her own face a mask of turmoil. "Commander, your orders." Kalen opened his beak to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He was the commander of the most powerful diplomatic fleet in the quadrant, armed with weapons that could crack a moon. And he was completely and utterly disarmed by a picture of a child. He stared at the silent station, no longer seeing cowering librarians, but something ancient and terrible. A ghost that knew all his secrets. The third diplomatic flotilla, 100 kilometers from its objective. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, lost its forward momentum. It did not retreat. It simply stopped, adrift in the silence, a collection of paralyzed predators held in check not by a shield, but by the crushing weight of their own history. Back in the station's core, Elias Thorne watched the flotilla's velocity indicators turn to zero. He felt no triumph, only a profound, hollow ache. He had helped Valerius craft those daggers, pulling each painful memory from the archives. It was the most violent thing he had ever done. "They will not fire," Valerius said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Not today." She looked at Elias, her expression softening for the briefest of moments. "They came to take our memory, archivist, and we have given them theirs. Now, we wait for them to understand what that truly means." The retreat of the 3rd Diplomatic Flotilla was not a rout. It was a dissolution. On the bridge of the unwavering gaze, the oppressive silence that had fallen in the face of the Terran data assault curdled into a thick, palpable shame. Commander Kalen stood on his dais. The ghostly image of his secret child burned into his memory. He looked out at the faces of his crew, and for the first time in his career, he saw not a disciplined unit, but a collection of broken individuals, each trapped in the sudden, glaring light of a private truth. The flawless machinery of his command had been shattered not by a torpedo, but by a whisper. There were no orders to give that could fix this. He could not command them to unknow what they now knew. He could not order the rage, betrayal, and fear to recede. The flotilla was a weapon with a broken spirit, with a gesture that felt like the heaviest of his life. He keyed in the command for withdrawal. There was no grand turning maneuver, no defiant salute. The elegant Cygnian ships simply turned their tails to the silent station and began to accelerate, each vessel moving independently, their perfect formation forgotten. They fled like scavengers startled from a carcass, their only shared purpose a desperate need to put distance between themselves and the place that held their souls in its memory banks. Before they entered hyperspace, Kalen composed his report to High Mediator Lyra. His talons clicked on the console as he carefully wove a tapestry of lies. He spoke of gravimetric anomalies, of a previously unknown form of defensive energy that disrupted ship systems on a quantum level. He described it as a passive, overwhelming force, a silent scream in the fabric of space-time that made sustained command impossible. He called it a weapon of last resort, a dead hand switch built into the station itself. It was a good lie technical, unverifiable, and far more palatable than the truth that his entire command had been neutralized by blackmail. He sent the report, a final act of self-preservation that he knew was also an act of galactic escalation, and then gave the final order. The stars outside the viewport stretched into streaks of blue-white light, and the terminus system, with its small, dark station, vanished from sight. On Menamazani, Elias watched the last of the flotilla's energy signatures fade from the tactical display. The tension that had held him rigid for hours finally released, leaving him feeling hollowed out and weak. There was no cheer, no celebration. The other archivists remained at their stations, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of their screens. The station's foundational hum, the only sound. It was a victory that felt exactly like a defeat. He made his way back to the central core, where Valerius stood as she had before, a statue carved from resolve. "They are gone," he said, the words tasting like ash. "For now." She corrected him without turning. "Kalen will lie. He will invent a phantom weapon to save his pride. That lie will reach Spire, and Lyra will use it as justification for her next move." She turned to him then, and for the first time, He saw the immense fatigue in her eyes. They still think this is about power. They have not yet begun to understand it is about consequence. The consequences began to arrive within a day. Kalen's fabricated report spread through the concordance like a virus, mutating with each telling. The Terrans hadn't just sealed the archives, they had weaponized them. They possessed a doomsday device, a truth bomb that could destabilize an entire fleet. Fear, where there had been only arrogance, began to take root. On Spire, the Grand Chamber was no longer a place of debate but a cauldron of paranoia. High Mediator Lyra, her avian features contorted in a mask of fury, displayed Kalen's report for all to see. "This is an act of war," she screeched, her voice echoing off the crystalline walls. "The Terrans have revealed their true nature. They are not custodians, they are jailers." But her authority, once absolute, was now being questioned. A lumbering delegate from a silicon-based race, whose species processed logic in centuries-long cycles, chimed in with a slow, grinding tone. "Query if the Terrans possess such a weapon. Why was it not used before? Why has it been deployed only in a defensive posture?" The commander's report is inefficient in its explanation. The Glyphican Dominion's ambassador, his voice dripping with righteous zeal, declared it a sign of Terran heresy, a defilement of the sacred act of memory that demanded a crusade. Others, whose economies were already collapsing from the lack of authenticated data, urged caution, even supplication. The Concordance, the great, unified body that had policed the galaxy for 1,000 years, was beginning to splinter along its oldest fault lines. While the powerful argued, the powerless began to die. The first verified report came from a terraformed moon called Zelos. It was a delicate, jewel-like world home to 3 billion souls, whose thin, nitrogen-rich atmosphere was maintained by a network of ancient terraforming machines. The operational algorithms for these machines were immensely complex, constantly adjusted based on geological and solar flare data, cross-referenced against a 5,000-year history of atmospheric fluctuation. The complete, uncorrupted master file for those algorithms was stored only in the Kronos archives. For a month, the engineers on Xylos had been managing with cached data, but a sudden, unexpected spike in solar radiation had pushed the system beyond its predictive capacity. They sent a desperate, frantic query to Mnemosyne Station, a plea not for a treaty or a charter, but for the mathematical sequence that kept their air breathable. It was logged in Elias's queue like any other, and like any other, it received the automated reply, "Access denied. Record sealed by Terran mandate." Elias watched the aftermath on the public data streams. He saw the first reports of atmospheric containment failures in the moon's polar regions. He saw the grainy panicked footage of citizens being herded into subterranean shelters as strange, rust-colored clouds rolled across the manicured plains. He watched a Xylosian official, her face streaked with tears, beg the Concordance, beg anyone, to reason with the Terrans. "They don't understand," she wept. "We are not soldiers. We are farmers, artists. Our children are choking. What have we done to deserve this?" Elias felt a physical sickness clawing its way up his throat. He had envisioned this mandate as a precise strategic strike against the arrogant heart of the Concordance. He had never imagined it would become an indiscriminate siege against the innocent. The personal daggers he had helped Valerius craft for the flotilla had been sharp and clean. This felt like a blunt, clumsy cudgel, crushing everyone in its path. He could not bear it. He left his station and stormed towards the central core. the Xylosian mother's weeping face replaying in his mind. He found Valerius observing the orrery. The light representing Xylos was flickering violently, a star on the verge of going out. "We have to answer them," Elias said, his voice ragged, skipping the pretense of protocol. "We have to send them the data. People are dying." Valerius did not look away from the dying light. "Yes, they are," she said, her tone as level and calm as a frozen lake. "And it is a tragedy." "A tragedy we can stop," Elias insisted, stepping in front of her. "This has gone too far. Our purpose is to preserve knowledge, to protect history, not to hold it for ransom while worlds suffocate." For the first time, a flicker of hard, cold anger showed on Valerius's face. "Our purpose," she said, her voice dropping, each word a chip of ice, "is to ensure humanity's survival and the sanctity of our role, a role the Concordance has systematically degraded for a century. Do you think I am ignorant of the cost? Archivist, do you think I don't see that light flickering?" She pointed a long, steady finger at the orrery. "I see them all. I see the medical supply chains failing because pharmaceutical patents can no longer be verified. I see asteroid mining colonies descending into anarchy over unprovable claims. I see the first tremors of a dozen civil wars. This is the price of their addiction. For centuries, they have offloaded their entire civilizational memory onto us. They built a galactic empire that cannot function for a single week without our labor, and they called us servants." She stepped closer to Elias, her eyes boring into his. "The pain is the point. Elias, it is the only thing they will ever understand. We cannot relent, not for Xylos, not for anyone. If we give them the data now, we teach them only that our resolve can be broken by their suffering. We teach them nothing." Elias stared at her, horrified. He had believed in the mandate's goal, but he was seeing now the brutal, uncompromising calculus of its architect. He had thought they were sending a message, but Valerius was burning down the entire postal service to prove a point. "So we just watch them die," he whispered, the question hanging in the humming air of the core. Valerius's expression was one of profound, ancient sorrow, the look of a surgeon who knows they must cut through living flesh to save the patient. "We hold the line," she said, turning back to the orrery, "and we remember their names." Elias stood frozen, the director's cold resolve a wall he could not breach. He was trapped. He was a keeper of memories who was now being forced to be a creator of ghosts. On his personal console, a new alert began to blink, a red, insistent pulse from Xylos. It wasn't a query anymore. It was an obituary, being written in real time. The light representing Xylos in the orrery did not go out with a sudden pop. It simply faded, turning from a frantic and flickering red to a dull, bruised purple. And then, over the course of 3 agonizing hours, it vanished completely. 3 billion souls, a unique culture, a history stretching back millennia, all of it was reduced to a dark spot on a map. A new ghost in the machine. The official death toll, when it was finally confirmed by a concordant scout ship that arrived too late, was a number so vast it became an abstraction. But Elias saw the individual faces. News streams, defying concordant sensors, broadcast the final. Desperate messages from the moon holovids of families huddled in failing shelters, their faces etched with a confusion that was somehow worse than terror, wondering why the galaxy had abandoned them. For humanity, the custodians of memory, this was a new and terrible entry in their ledger, a genocide by omission. On Spire, the news of Xylos shattered the political deadlock. The debate was no longer about Terran aggression, but about Terran monstrosity. High Mediator Lyra, seizing the narrative with masterful opportunism, used the tragedy as her clarion call. Kalen's lie about a phantom weapon was now interwoven with the truth of Xylos's fate. The Terrans, she declared before a horrified Grand Chamber, had not just sealed the archives, they had booby-trapped them. They had created a system where any attempt to access life-saving data would trigger a catastrophic failure. They were not just jailers, they were executioners. And Xylos was their first victim. It was a brilliant, cynical move, transforming a crime of inaction into one of active malice. And it worked. The fractured concordance, desperate for a villain to unify them, rallied behind her. A new resolution was passed, not for diplomacy or enforcement, but for liberation. And they would assemble a true war fleet, an armada drawn from the combined might of the core worlds, and they would seize Minamazani Station by force, not to punish the Terrans, but to save the galaxy from them. For Elias Thorne, the news of the coming armada was the final breaking stress on his conscience. He had been complicit. His finger had pressed the button that sealed Xylos's fate. He could no longer hide behind the excuse of following orders. Valerius's cold logic, her willingness to sacrifice billions for a principle, was a form of madness he could not abide. He looked at the other archivists in their alcoves, at their pale, silent faces, and he saw the same horror reflected in their eyes. Trapped behind a mask of professional duty, they were all holding the line, but the line had become a precipice, and they were pushing entire civilizations over the edge. He knew he could not act alone. Valerius's control over the station was absolute. Every system, every conduit, was monitored. A single unauthorized query would bring the station's internal security down on him in moments. He needed an ally, someone who knew the station's hidden pathways, its digital back doors. He thought of Kyle, a senior archivist who had been on the station for over a century, a quiet, unassuming man who had taught Elias the fundamentals of data stream navigation when he was just a boy. Kyle was a purist, a man who believed in the sanctity of the archives with a devotion that bordered on the religious. He would be appalled by the soul mandate. Elias found him in a dusty by forgotten sector of the lower archives, a place where deprecated data formats were stored in physical crystal matrices. Kyle was tending to the crystals, his long, thin fingers polishing a shard that contained the pre-spaceflight poetry of a species long extinct. "They're killing people. Kyle," Elias began, his voice a raw whisper. Kyle didn't look up from his work. "They have been killing people for a long time, Elias. The Concordance, with their convenient truths and their redacted histories. We have always known this." "No," Elias insisted, stepping closer. We are killing them. Xylos is dead because of us. Because of this mandate. Valerius is willing to let the galaxy burn to prove a point." Kale finally set the crystal down and looked at Elias, his old eyes filled with a weary sadness. "And what point are you trying to prove, my boy?" "That we are librarians," Elias said, his voice gaining strength. "Not gods. We cannot be the arbiters of who lives and who dies. That is a truth more fundamental than any record in this station." He took a deep breath. "The Concordance is sending a war fleet. They think we have some kind of doomsday weapon. They're going to destroy the station, destroy everything, to get to it. We have to stop this. We have to break the mandate from the inside." Kyle was silent for a long time, studying Elias's face. "Valerius will see it coming," he said quietly. "She is the archive made flesh. She senses every tremor in the data stream. Not if we don't try to break through her firewalls," Elias countered, his plan, half-formed and desperate, beginning to solidify. "We have to go deeper, below the active records, below even these deprecated formats. We have to access the core programming, the station's charter." Every archivist knew of the charter as a theoretical concept, a set of foundational protocols laid down by the first generation of humans who built Mnemosyne. It was the station's constitution, unalterable and accessible only under the most extreme circumstances. One of those circumstances was a protocol Elias had only ever read about in historical files, the Lethe Protocol. It was a measure of last resort, a failsafe designed to prevent the archives from ever being used as a weapon of ultimate destruction. It was the archivist's final taboo, the power not just to seal a memory, but to erase it. The protocol allowed for the complete, utter, and irretrievable deletion of a single record from the archives, an act so profound it would rewrite history itself. "No one has accessed the charter in 300 years, Kale whispered, a flicker of fear in his eyes. "It's a suicide mission. Valerius has locked it down with safeguards we can't even imagine." "But it has a failsafe," Elias pressed. "A codicil of existential threat. If the station itself is facing imminent destruction, and if that destruction poses a threat to galactic stability, a junior archivist, confirmed by a senior archivist, can bypass command authority and trigger a core directive. It was designed to prevent a rogue director from ever taking the station hostage, like now." Their plan was audacious and terrifying. They would not leak the data for Xylos. It was too late for that. They would leak a single, different truth. The concordance was coming because they feared a weapon that didn't exist. So Elias and Kale would give them a reason to fear a weapon that did. They would unseal and transmit a single, devastating record, a truth so toxic it would stop the war fleet in its tracks and force Valerius to the negotiating table. They would fight her weaponized silence with a single weaponized truth. The record they chose was buried deep, a ghost that had haunted the concordance for centuries, the unredacted logs of the Cygnian First Expansion. The official history told a story of peaceful uplift, of the benevolent Cygnians guiding younger races into the galactic community. The sealed archive told a different story, a brutal campaign of cultural erasure, biological warfare, and the systematic extermination of any species that resisted assimilation, including the original inhabitants of two of the Concordance's current member worlds. It was the foundational lie upon which the entire Cygnian ascendancy, and by extension the Concordance itself, was built. Releasing it would not just disgrace Lyra, it would delegitimize her entire species' claim to moral authority. It was a truth that could shatter the Concordance for good, but it might be the only thing that could stop the approaching armada. As the Concordance fleet mustered in the core systems, its engines lighting up the void, Elias and Kyle began their descent into the station's digital soul. Using Kyle's knowledge of forgotten maintenance tunnels and obsolete network nodes, they bypassed Valerius's primary surveillance grid. It was a tense, nerve-wracking journey through their own home, which now felt like enemy territory. They finally reached a small, unmarked access panel in the station's deepest sublevel, a direct interface with the raw programming of the charter. The air here was cold, and the hum of the station was a deep, resonant thrum, the sound of a sleeping god's heartbeat. Kyle began the delicate work of unlocking the primary seals, his aged fingers dancing across a holographic interface. "The fleet has entered the outer systems," Elias reported, monitoring external sensors on a handheld datapad. "They will be in weapons range in 2 hours." It is enough time, Kyle muttered, his brow beaded with sweat. Almost there. The codicil is responding. He worked faster, bypassing the layers of archaic security. A final firewall appeared, a shimmering wall of code that pulsed with malevolent energy. This is her, Kael breathed. A personal lock. Valerius. Elias watched the incoming fleet's markers on his datapad, their icons glowing like angry red eyes. Time was running out. He felt a sudden, ice-cold certainty. She knows. As if in answer, the lights in the sublevel flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. The humming of the station stopped. The silence that fell was not the curated quiet of the archives. It was the dead, empty silence of a tomb. Then, a single, cold light illuminated them from the corridor behind, pinning them against the access panel. Director Valerius stood there, her silhouette framed in the doorway, her face an unreadable mask of shadow. "I had hoped," she said, her voice echoing in the dead air, "that you would have more respect for the memory of the dead. Archivist Thorn." "Respect for the memory of the dead," Elias shot back, his voice echoing in the sudden, tomb-like silence. The fear that had held him frozen was burned away by a surge of righteous fury. "You created 3 billion new dead for us to remember on Xylos. Do you have any respect for them?" Valerius did not flinch. She took a slow, deliberate step out of the doorway, the single beam of light from her hand luminary casting long, distorted shadows across the chamber. Xylos was a casualty of a war the Concordance declared a century ago. Archivist. A war of neglect and exploitation. Their deaths are on Lyra's hands, not mine. I simply sent her the bill. And you used us, this station. Our sacred duty to right it. Kael interjected, his voice a low, trembling growl. You have corrupted the very soul of this place. No, Valerius corrected, her voice chillingly calm. I have reminded the galaxy that it has a soul, and that for 500 years we have been its only guardian. You see this as a betrayal. I see it as the final, necessary lesson. You sought to leak one truth to stop their fleet. A noble but futile gesture. You would have been martyrs, and your truth would have been buried with you. I have a more comprehensive solution. As she spoke, it is. A deep, structural groan reverberated through the station's hull. On Elias's datapad, the red icons of the Concordance Armada resolved into terrifying detail. They had arrived. They were forming a siege line, a net of overwhelming firepower designed to obliterate any phantom weapon and crack the station open like a nut. A new light flooded the sublevel, not from the corridor, but from the crystalline conduits in the walls. They began to pulse with a fierce, silver light, the hum returning not as a gentle thrum, but as a rising, keening song of immense power. "What are you doing?" Elias demanded, shielding his eyes. "You said it yourself," Valerius replied, her voice now barely audible over the rising crescendo. "The codicil of existential threat. The station is facing imminent destruction. Command authority is now flexible." She raised her hand, and the holographic interface of the charter sprang to life before her, unlocked and waiting. She had not come to stop them. She had been waiting for them to provide the key. On the bridge of the Celestial Vengeance, High Mediator Lyra watched Minimazani Station on her main view screen. It was dark, silent, and appeared utterly defenseless. It was an anticlimax. "All ships, report readiness," she commanded, a preening satisfaction in her voice. "Target their primary power core. I want a surgical strike. We are here to liberate the archives, not annihilate them. A chorus of confirmations echoed across the bridge. Fire on my mark. The station before them suddenly blazed with light, not the flare of a shield, but a soft, pervasive glow that emanated from the station itself, as if it had become a small, man-made star, simultaneously. Every ship in the Armada received a single massive data packet. It was not an attack, not a virus, not a personal secret. It was an index, a table of contents for the entire Kronos archives. There were no details, no files to open. There was only a list, trillions of entries long, of every record humanity had ever safeguarded, and it was now being broadcast on an open channel to the entire fleet. On the bridge of the Unwavering Gaze, now relegated to a secondary command role, Commander Kalen stared at the list scrolling down his screen. He saw entries that made his feathers stand on end. Cathar Famine Concordance Complicity Report, sealed by Signian Edict. Voltan Consortium, evidence of illegal arms, trading with Outer Rim warlords. And then he saw it. The one Elias and Kael had sought Signian First Expansion unredacted casualty logs and Protocol 7 planetary sterilization. He looked at his crew and saw them staring at their own consoles, their faces a mixture of confusion, horror, and dawning comprehension. They were seeing the titles of all the lies they had been told, all the secrets their leaders had buried. Aboard the Celestial Vengeance, Lyra's face contorted in rage. It's a bluff, a final, desperate act of Terran trickery. Ignore their phantom list, and her command was cut short by a voice from the station, broadcast over the same open channel. It was Valerius. Her voice was not angry or triumphant, but as calm and steady as a law of physics. This is Director Valerius of the Kronos Archives. What you are receiving is the index of your history, your triumphs, your shames, your laws, and your crimes. The station is now under attack. As per the Foundational Charter, a final preservation protocol has been initiated. If the station's integrity is breached, the entire archive, every file, every record, every truth you have hidden from your own people will be simultaneously broadcast across every open network in the galaxy. A stunned silence fell over the Armada. The threat was not a weapon that could kill them, but a truth that could undo them. It was not a bomb, it was a promise. Valerius's voice continued. However, you have a choice. Cease your attack. Recognize the sovereignty of this station and the autonomy of the Terran Archivist Order, and we will begin a new dialogue, not as your servants, but as your partners. We will help you build a concordance worthy of the name, one founded not on convenient lies but on the full, difficult weight of your own history. Destroy us, and you destroy yourselves. Let us live, and you will finally be forced to live with the truth. The choice is yours. On the bridge of the Celestial Vengeance, Lyra screamed, "Fire, fire now! You fools, she is lying." But no one moved. The weapons officers stared at the index, at the names of atrocities committed in their names. The navigators saw the titles of secret treaties that had sold out their homeworlds. A mutiny, silent and instantaneous, had taken place on 1,000 bridges at once. Commander Kalen was the first to act. His voice, crisp and clear, cut through the comms. Unwavering gaze to Armada Command. We are standing down. We will not fire on the archives. We will not be party to the destruction of galactic truth. One by one, other ships followed his lead. The sunlit blade stands down. The Gilded Talon is powering down weapons. Lyra watched her authority, her empire of lies, evaporate in real time. The Armada, her great instrument of liberation, had turned into a silent, floating jury. In the sublevel of Mnemosany Station, the blinding light from the conduit softened, the keening hum returning to a gentle thrum. Elias looked from the interface to Valerius, a profound, world-altering understanding dawning on him. She had never intended to let the galaxy burn. She had not sacrificed Xylos for a principle. She had allowed their tragedy to become the ultimate, undeniable proof of the Concordance's failure, the final entry in the list of grievances she was about to present to the universe. It was a terrible, brutal, and flawlessly executed gambit. "You played them all," Elias whispered, a note of awe in his voice. "I simply held up a mirror," Valerius replied, her expression softening into one of immense, soul-deep weariness. "And I prayed they would not smash it." The Concordance did not survive that day, not in its old form. Lyra was recalled in disgrace, her legacy forever stained by the truths she had tried to bury. In its place, a new council was tentatively formed, its first act a formal request for Terran mediation, not as servants, but as equals. The sole mandate was lifted, but the archives were never the same. Access was restored, but it came with a new price transparency. No record could be sealed by a single political body ever again. Humanity's role had changed forever. They were no longer the galaxy's silent, passive memory. They were its conscience. Elias Thorne, no longer a junior archivist, became one of the first of a new generation of archivists, the diplomats of memory who traveled the galaxy, not just to verify facts, but to teach others the hard, necessary lessons of their own histories. He never fully forgave Valerius for the cost of her victory, but he understood it. For true peace could not be built on a foundation of convenient silence. It had to be built on the bedrock of memory, in all its pain and all its glory. And in the great, humming quiet of Mnemosany Station, humanity held the line, not to keep others out, but to finally, after centuries of service, invite the galaxy in.